take your filthy, calloused black hands off that keyboard before you ruin a masterpiece, old man.
Sterling Ashford III snarled the words and snatched the microphone off its stand, his face twisting with absolute disgust. He stepped forward and shoved the elderly custodian back into the shadows of the gold-lit gala stage.
Look at yourself. You've got dust on your gray coat and garbage in your brains. A broken-down black janitor thinks he can touch a $2 million instrument? Go back to your broom closet and scrub the toilets before I have security throw your worthless ass onto the curb where your kind belongs.
400 of the richest people in America erupted into cruel, mocking laughter, but Elias Whitfield did not flinch. He did not bow his head, and he did not step down. He simply stood his ground beside the silent piano, his stone-steady eyes locked on the arrogant young virtuoso. This piano has not made a true sound in 34 years, Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it moved through the sudden silence of the hall like thunder. And I know exactly why. Because your grandfather stole my whole life to build your family's legacy. Subscribe if you believe that justice always finds a way. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Because what this invisible old master played next did not just break a lie that had stood for 34 years. It brought an entire empire crashing down. Let me take you back. Back to 6 o'clock that morning. Hours before the black cars and the champagne. When the great hall was dark and empty. And the only man awake inside it was the one everybody thought they already knew. Vandermeer Hall stood on a hill above the river like a cathedral that had decided to worship money instead of God. It was built in 1911 by a shipping fortune, faced in limestone, the color of old ivory, and crowned with a dome that 4 generations of the city's wealthy had gazed up at while pretending to listen to Beethoven. Inside, the main hall seated 800 people beneath a ceiling of gilded plaster and a chandelier that had cost, in its day, more than most men made in a lifetime. There was a stage of Brazilian rosewood. There was an organ with 4,000 pipes, and along the eastern wall, in a gallery of glass and velvet rope, sat the Vandermeer collection, the finest gathering of historic pianos in the country. At the center of that collection, on a low platform behind the thickest rope, sat a black concert grand. It was a Duval, made by a company that had gone extinct in 1948, an instrument so rare that only 3 of its kind had survived, and men spoke of them the way they speak of lost cities. This one was the finest of the 3, 9 feet of black lacquer, so deep and so dark that on a bright morning it seemed to swallow the light coming through the eastern windows and give nothing back. The placard beside it, engraved in brass, called it the Silent Duval, an irreplaceable artifact of American musical history. What the placard did not say was that the instrument had not produced a single true note in 34 years, that every technician who had ever opened it had closed it again, shaking his head, and that the Ashford family, who had donated it. I preferred it exactly that way. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when the hall was dark except for the security lamps and the red glow of the exit signs, a man in a gray coat let himself in through the loading door on the north side. His name was Elias Whitfield. Everyone called him Eli, when they called him anything at all. He was 61 years old. His hair was iron and salt, cut close. His skin was the color of walnut, heartwood, and his hands. This was the thing people never looked at, because they never looked at him. His hands were extraordinary. Long fingers, wide flat pads, the nails trimmed down to nothing. Not a laborer's hands. Though they had done 30 years of labor. Steady hands, stone steady. He could hold a tuning wrench against a string stretched to 160 pounds of tension and move it a hair's width and stop it exactly where he meant to. Every time. 1,000 times a day. He had been the head piano technician at Vandermeer Hall for 19 years. Before that, he had tuned pianos in churches, in school basements, in the back rooms of pawn shops, in living rooms where the family watched him from the doorway as if he might steal the silverware. He kept his own hours. He was never late. He fixed things nobody else could fix. And he asked nothing of anyone except the work. And the work was the only thing he had let himself love in a very long time. That morning, like every morning for the past 3 weeks, he did not go straight to the workshop. He walked out onto the empty main floor. He stood at the velvet rope in front of the black Duval, and he looked at it. And he did not touch it. He had been doing this for 21 days. Nobody had noticed. A janitor standing near a piano at dawn is the most invisible thing in the world. 3 weeks earlier, the Ashford family had announced that the Vandermeer collection was being restored and revealed to the public at a grand gala, and that the centerpiece of that gala would be the black Duval, cleaned and polished and lit, sitting on the main stage as a silent monument. While Sterling Ashford III performed the family's most famous work, Eli had read the announcement in the staff bulletin, standing up in the break room, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He read it twice. Then he folded the bulletin along its crease, and folded it again, and pressed it flat with the side of his thumb, and slid it into the inside pocket of his gray coat, against his chest, over his heart. And he walked out to the gallery and looked at the piano for the first time in 30 years. He knew that piano. He knew it the way you know a face you loved before it was scarred. But that story comes later. That story is the whole reason for this one. And if I tell it too soon, you will not feel it land the way it landed on 400 people in that hall. So, hold it. Just hold it. The way Eli held it, flat against his chest. For 21 mornings, there was a boy who saw him standing there. His name was Theo Marsh. He was 20 years old, white, freckled, with a scholarship that covered his tuition at the conservatory attached to the hall, and a work-study job that covered nothing else. He ran cable. He set up chairs. He carried things. In the whole ecosystem of Vandermeer Hall, he was one notch above invisible and one notch below noticed, which meant that he and Eli lived on roughly the same layer of the building's attention. Which is to say, none at all. A year before, Theo had been ordered to move a 19th century square piano from the storage vault to the recital room, alone, with a hand truck, because the man who was supposed to help him had called in sick and nobody upstairs cared. The instrument weighed 600 pounds. Theo had gotten it stuck at a threshold, one wheel off the ramp, the whole thing tipping, and he had stood there for a full minute, with his shoulder jammed under a priceless antique and terror climbing up his throat, unable to move it forward or back, certain he was about to hear the sound of history breaking and his scholarship going with it. Eli had come down the hall with a mop bucket. He looked at the situation for about 3 seconds. Then he set down the bucket, pulled a folded moving blanket, and a length of strapping off a shelf Theo had not even known was there, slid a pry bar the length of his forearm under the low corner, and said, "Push when I lift, not before." Theo pushed when he lifted. The piano rolled clear. The whole thing took 90 seconds. Theo, and still shaking, had tried to give the old man the $20 in his wallet. It was all he had until Friday. Eli had closed the boy's fingers back over the bill and pushed his hand away. "Keep your money," he said. "Learn to look at a shelf before you carry a piano past it. That is the only rent I charge." Theo had brought him a coffee every morning since. Black. No sugar. He had figured that out on his own. He set it on the corner of the workbench where Eli would find it. And most mornings the two of them did not say 10 words. And it was one of the best friendships either of them had. So on the morning I am telling you about, when Theo came in at 6:15 with 2 coffees and saw the old man standing at the velvet rope in front of the black Duval, not moving, not touching it, just looking, Theo did not interrupt. He set the second coffee on a chair by the rope where Eli would see it. And he backed away. And he watched. He had been watching for 3 weeks. He did not understand it. But he had learned, over the past year, that when Elias Whitfield went quiet and still in front of something, it was because that something had a secret. And Eli was the only man in the building who could hear it. There was a woman who saw him too. Her name was Renee Charles. She was 44, black, born in the north end of the city. And until 8 months ago, she had been the classical music critic for the biggest newspaper in town. She was the first black critic that paper had ever put on the music desk. And the last. Because when the paper cut its arts coverage down to a single freelancer, she was the one they cut. She had spent 20 years reviewing the very galas she could no longer get a press pass to. Now she wrote a newsletter that 1,100 people paid for, and 40,000 people read for free. And she was, though nobody at Vandermeer Hall would have admitted it, the most dangerous writer in the city. Because she was the only one left who still asked the questions the sponsors did not want asked. Renee had gotten into the hall that week, the way she got in everywhere now. By knowing a stagehand, by moving like she belonged, by being a middle-aged black woman that security simply assumed was somebody's assistant. She was there because of a rumor, an old rumor, buried 34 years deep, about the most celebrated piece of American concert music of the 20th century, and the man whose name was on it, and a name that was not. She had come to look at the black Duval, and instead, she had found herself looking at the man who was looking at the black Duval. She had watched the janitor for 3 mornings. She had watched him stand at that rope with a stillness that was not idle, was not tired, was not the stillness of a man killing time before a shift. It was the stillness of a man at a graveside. On the second morning, she had walked close enough to read the name stitched on his coat. E. Whitfield. She had written it in her notebook, and then she had gone home and pulled a box down from a closet, a box of research she had been keeping for 11 years. And she had found, in an old concert program, a photograph of a young black pianist with the whole future in his eyes, and beneath it a name, Elias Whitfield, composé en résidence. She had sat on her floor for an hour with that program in her lap. Then she had come back to the hall every single morning after, because she knew, the way she had always known things before the facts caught up, that the story everyone thought they were coming to see on gala night was not the story that was going to happen. To understand what the Black Duval really was, you have to understand the man whose family owned it. And to understand him, you have to go all the way back to his grandfather, Sterling Ashford Sr., was, when he died, the most decorated American composer of his century. He had written the score that every school child in the country could hum 8 bars of without knowing where they had learned it. He had conducted at 2 presidential inaugurations. There was a bust of him in the lobby of Vandermeer Hall, and a scholarship in his name, and a wing of the conservatory, and a music prize, and even a face on a postage stamp. He was called, in the phrase that appeared on 100 album covers, the man who gave America its own voice. His masterwork was a 52-minute suite for piano and full symphony, and it was called American Rhapsody. It had premiered at Vandermeer Hall in 1991. The critics had wept. It braided together. They said, the deep hymns of the American soul into a single towering statement. Church and field and river and railroad, all the raw sorrow and stubborn hope of a young country, rendered at last into the language of high art. It was the sound of America growing up. It was, they said, is un miracle. Nobody in that hall in 1991 asked whose hymns those really were. Nobody asked whose sorrow. Nobody asked why a 70-year-old white man from the wealthy end of town had suddenly, at the very end of a competent and forgettable career, produced a work of shattering originality that sounded like nothing he had ever written before. And everything his young black composer in residence had been playing alone in a practice room for 3 years. Sterling Ashford Sr. died rich and honored and buried under so much marble that the truth would have needed a jackhammer to reach it. His son inherited the money and the name and none of the talent, and had the good sense to become a lawyer instead of a musician. And his son's son, Sterling Ashford III, inherited the money, the name, and a genuine, undeniable gift, which was the cruelest inheritance of all, because it meant he never once in his life had to wonder whether he had earned the room he was standing in. Sterling III was 34 years old. He had trained at the finest schools on 2 continents. His fingers were fast and clean and brilliant. And he knew it, and everyone who had ever paid to hear him knew it. And the knowledge had settled into him and turned, somewhere along the way, from confidence into something colder. He walked through Vandermeer Hall the way a man walks through a house he expects to inherit. He called the security guards by the wrong names. He did not know the janitor's name at all. And if you had told him that one day he would need to, he would have laughed. The gala was his idea. American Rhapsody, performed by the grandson of the man who wrote it. On the great stage where it had premiered, with the legendary Silent Duval, the very piano his grandfather had supposedly composed it on, polished and lit beside him, as a monument. A coronation, $2 million in prize money attached to the evening, funded by the Ashford Foundation, and awarded by a jury the Ashfords had selected, to the performance the Ashfords already knew would win. It was going to be, the invitations promised, a celebration of the American voice. Elias Whitfield read that invitation in the staff bulletin. He knew exactly whose voice they were about to celebrate. He knew, because it was his. And he knew the piano they were going to stand beside like a holy relic, because he had composed the whole thing on it. Alone, that night, 34 years ago, before a rich old man put a different name on the work and had the instrument's true voice cut out of it, so that no one could ever compare the two. That was the secret. Eli held flat against his chest for 21 mornings. That was why he stood at the rope and did not touch the piano, because touching it would have broken him, and he had spent 30 years learning how not to break. Here is what happened to Elias Whitfield, told the way he told it later. Once, to the one reporter who asked him gently enough that he answered, he was born in the north end of the city, in a house with an upright piano his grandmother had gotten from a church that was closing. His grandmother had been born in South Carolina and had come north during the Great Migration with a suitcase and a hymn book and a voice that could stop traffic. She sang the old songs, the sorrow songs, the spirituals that her own grandmother had sung in a language of pure survival, coded songs about rivers to cross and chariots coming and a promised land on the far side of an ocean of grief. She sang them while she cooked and while she cleaned other people's houses and while she rocked young Eli to sleep. And by the time he was 6, he could play every one of them. And by the time he was 12, he was taking them apart and building whole cathedrals out of them. He won a scholarship, then another, He was the kind of talent that makes older musicians go quiet in a room. And at 27, he became the first black composer in residence in the entire history of Vandermeer Hall. In an institution that was 140 years into a policy it had never written down, but had never once broken. They gave him a practice room and a small stipend. And, for 3 years, a mentor, the aging maestro Sterling Ashford Sr., whose best work was decades behind him, and who had taken the residency post as a favor to the board. That was really a favor to his own fading relevance. Eli was working on something. He had been working on it since his grandmother's funeral. A suite for piano and orchestra, built entirely out of the spirituals. Not quoting them, not decorating with them, but excavating them, following each one down to its root and up into forms no one had ever tried before. He called it the Deliverance Suite. He played it for the old maestro, movement by movement, over 3 years, in a practice room, with one window and a black Duval concert grand that the hall let him use because nobody else wanted the old thing. He trusted the old man. Of course he trusted him. The old man was kind. In the careful way of powerful people who have decided to be kind to you. He asked questions. He took notes. He said, more than once, Elias, this is the most important thing anyone has written in this building in 50 years. And then, in the spring of 1991, Sterling Ashford Sr. premiered American Rhapsody at Vandermeer Hall, and the critics wept, and it was Eli's suite. Not similar to it, not influenced by it. It was the Deliverance Suite, reorchestrated, its movements resequenced, its title changed, its origins scrubbed. The spirituals were still there in the marrow of it, but stripped of their names, so that a river that had meant the Jordan and the Ohio and the road to freedom was now just a river, American and vague and belonging to no one, which is to say, belonging to the man on the podium. Taking his bow, Eli was in the audience. He had not been invited to the stage. He stood up, in the 3rd year of his residency, in a room full of people applauding his stolen life's work under another man's name. And he did the thing that ended him. He said something, not a scene. Eli never made scenes. But he went to the board. He brought his manuscripts, the practice room drafts, dated, in his own hand, the notes in the margins, the whole 3-year archaeology of the thing. He brought the piano technician's logs, showing which instrument the work had been written on. He asked, quietly, formally, for the truth to simply be acknowledged. The institution did what institutions do. They offered him money, a great deal of it, for a young man with nothing, enough to change his life. On one condition, printed on the last page, in careful legal language, that he sign away, permanently and totally, any claim to the work, and any right to ever speak of it again. A confidentiality agreement, a price on his silence, his grandmother's songs, his 3 years, his name, all of it, purchased and sealed, in exchange for a life of quiet comfort and a promise never to open his mouth. He was 29. His wife, Ruth, was sick. She would not live to see 40 pregnant. They had no savings, and the money would have paid for everything. And every reasonable person in his life told him to take it. He did not take it. He told them no. He told them that his grandmother had walked north out of South Carolina with nothing but those songs in her name. That she had cleaned rich people's floors for 40 years and never once let them buy her silence, and that he would be damned before he sold hers. So they blacklisted him. It was never called that. Nothing was ever called anything. But the residency was not renewed. The commission stopped. The recommendation letters dried up. The young man, who had been the most important composer in the building, became, over about 18 months, a man no orchestra in the country would touch. Because the word had gone out, in the quiet channels where such words travel, that Elias Whitfield was difficult, was unstable, was not a team player, was making unfounded accusations against a beloved national figure who, everyone agreed, far too great a man to have needed to steal anything. Ruth died in the winter of 1993. Eli was 31, and Elias Whitfield, who had been going to be the composer, who finally forced America to hear whose voice it had been singing in all along, put down his pen and did not pick it up again. He needed to work. He knew instruments the way he knew his own hands. So he learned to tune them, to repair them, to stand behind the piano instead of in front of it, in the one part of the music world that would still have him, the part nobody looks at. For 30 years, he tuned other people's pianos so that other people could play, and he was very good at it. And he never told a single soul who he had been, because who he had been was a wound. And you do not show people a wound just to watch them fail to understand it. The old maestro died in 2007. Marble and postage stamps and all, and the black Duval, the piano, the Deliverance Suite, had been born on, was donated to the Vandermeer collection by the Ashford family, who first had it quietly restored by a technician who was paid, though the paperwork would never say so, to replace its soundboard and alter its action so thoroughly that the instrument's distinctive voice was gone. The specific, unmistakable voice. A musicologist might one day have recognized in the piano part of American Rhapsody, cut out, the piano was silenced the same way its composer had been silenced, and for the very same reason, and then it was set behind a velvet rope with a brass placard, and the family told everyone that it was simply too old and too precious to play. The silent Duval. Eli had known where the piano was for years. He had stayed away from it the way you stay away from a grave you cannot bear to visit. And then they announced the gala. The gala was held on the last Saturday in October. And the weather that evening was the kind that makes rich people feel that the universe approves of them. Cold. Clear. The sky over the river gone a deep, bruised violet. The limestone of Vandermeer Hall lit gold from below, so that it glowed against the dark like something out of scripture. They came in black cars, 400 of them, the women in gowns and the men in tuxedos, and the whole eastern gallery cleared of its velvet ropes, so that the guests could drift among the historic pianos, with glasses of champagne, murmuring at the placards. There was a senator, silver-haired, who had once played clarinet in a college band and mentioned it at every fundraiser. There were foundation presidents. There was the board of Vandermeer Hall, seated in a row like a jury. There were critics, the ones who still had jobs. And there were 3 network cameras, because the Ashford Foundation had bought the coverage, and standing at the very back, near a service door, in the only plain black dress in the building, holding a press pass that said freelance in ballpoint over a crossed-out name, was Renee Charles. She had gotten in. She always got in. On the great stage, under a single warm spotlight, sat 2 pianos. One was a brand new concert grand, gleaming, perfect. The instrument Sterling Ashford III would play American Rhapsody on. The other, set slightly behind it and to the side, dark and enormous and lit from above so that its black lacquer drank the light, was the silent Duval, a monument, a relique, a corpse in a place of honor, and in the wings, in his gray coat, because someone had to be on hand in case an instrument needed attention, and because no one had thought to tell him not to come, stood Elias Whitfield. Theo was there, running a cable along the stage left curtain, close enough to see the old man's face. He would say later that Eli looked the way a man looks at a funeral. For someone, the other mourners did not know he loved. The evening began. The way these evenings begin. A foundation president spoke. The board chair spoke. A short film played on a screen above the stage, narrated in a reverent voice, about American Rhapsody, and the genius of Sterling Ashford Sr., and the miracle of an American voice. The Black Duval appeared in the film, in an old sepia photograph, with the maestro seated at it, and the narrator said, "It was on this very instrument that the maestro composed his immortal rhapsody, and in the wings." Eli's jaw tightened by a single degree. And that was all. And no one saw it but Theo. Then, Sterling Ashford III walked out onto the stage in a tuxedo that fit him like water. And the hall rose and applauded. And he sat down at the gleaming new piano. And he played. He was good. This is the part people want you to leave out. But it is the part that matters. He was genuinely, technically superb. His hands were fast and clean and sure. An American Rhapsody under his fingers was a glittering, powerful, thoroughly impressive thing. And 400 people sat in the gold-lit dark and let it wash over them, and believed, every one of them, that they were hearing a great man's grandson honor a great man's genius. Eli stood in the wings and listened to a stranger play his grandmother's songs, under a dead man's name, for a room full of people who would never know. He listened to all 52 minutes. He did not move, and when it ended, and the hall came to its feet in a roar, and Sterling III stood and bowed and gestured with an open hand toward the silent black piano beside him, toward the instrument, toward the legacy, toward the myth. Elias Whitfield understood that if he stood in those wings for 30 more seconds, the lie would close over the truth forever, sealed and marbled and applauded, and his grandmother's name, and Ruth's memory, and 3 years of his one wild life would go into the ground for good. So he walked out of the wings. He did not rush. He never rushed. He walked across the back of the stage in his gray coat, while Sterling III was still bowing, while the applause was still cresting, and he walked to the Black Duval, and he reached up and lifted the great curved lid and set it on its long prop, opening the instrument's throat to the room. It took the audience a moment to understand what they were seeing. A janitor, on the stage, opening the relic. The applause faltered, not all at once, but in a wave. The front rose first, then the middle, then the back. The way a field of wheat goes still when the wind drops. Sterling Ashford III turned from his bow and saw the old man at his grandfather's piano, and his face did something ugly and fast. And he crossed the stage and took the microphone off its stand. "Take your filthy, calloused hands off that instrument. Now," his voice went out over the 400, amplified, ringing off the gilded dome. "That is a 100-year-old masterpiece. That is worth more than this man will earn in 10 lifetimes." He turned to the audience, arm sweeping, playing the room. "And you, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me. I do not know how this happened. This is the man who empties the trash cans in this building. This is a custodian. On this stage, With his dust and his broom and his hands all over the silent Duval, a ripple went through the hall. Some of it was laughter. Some of it was the sharp intake of breath that means people are about to enjoy watching someone be humiliated and are ashamed of themselves for it. In the third row, a woman in deep green silk put her champagne down and did not pick it up again. Near the service door, Renee Charles lifted her phone and, silently, began to record. Elias Whitfield stood at the piano with one hand resting on its black flank. He did not lower his head. He looked at the young man holding the microphone, and he said, in a voice that did not need amplifying because the hall had gone quiet enough to hear it, "It has not sounded right in 30 years. I know why." Sterling laughed. It was a good laugh. Easy. Practiced. And the hall laughed with him. Because that is what a room does when a powerful man laughs first and gives it permission. You know why? He turned back to the crowd, delighted now. A cat with something small under its paw. Ladies and gentlemen, our custodian has a theory about the silent Duval, about the piano my grandfather composed American Rhapsody on, the greatest work in the American canon, and he is going to explain it to us. He looked back at Eli, and his smile thinned. Go on. Then, boy, let us all hear your theory. The word boy went out over 400 people through a microphone. It landed like a dropped wrench on marble. In the third row, the woman in green silk stood up. Her name was Eleanor Vandermeer. She was 78 years old. Her late husband's grandfather had built the hall. Her family's name was carved over its doors. She had sat in the third row on the aisle at every important event in that building for 50 years. And she had, in that half-century, seen a great many things she had chosen not to see, because that was what women of her position and her generation were trained to do, to look at the beautiful surface and let the rot stay buried where it could not spoil the evening. She had been at the premiere of American Rhapsody in 1991. She had wept along with everyone else, and she had heard, over the years, in the careful, lowered voices of very old people at very small dinners, a thing she had never repeated and never confirmed and never allowed herself to fully believe, because to believe it would have required her to do something, and she had reached her 8th decade without ever once having had to do something inconvenient. But she was old now, old enough that there was not much left to protect, and there was something about the way this old black man in a gray coat was standing at that piano, not cowering, not raging, just standing, with a terrible quiet dignity, while a boy she had known since his christening called him boy into a microphone, something that reached past 50 years of trained blindness and took hold of the one thing Eleanor Vandermeer had left, which was her shame. She stood up in the third row, and she said, in a voice that carried, "Let the man speak. Sterling, that is enough." Sterling turned, startled. "Mrs. Vandermeer." I said, "That is enough." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. This is my family's hall. His name is over the door with mine. Or it might as well be, for all the sweeping he has done in it. You will not call a grown man boy on my stage. Let him speak. For a moment the whole hall hung in the balance, and then the woman beside Eleanor stood up too. And then a man 3 rows back, a cellist, gray-bearded, who had spent his whole life in orchestras and knew exactly how the quiet channels worked and had always hated himself a little for it, stood up as well. 3 people, then 5, standing in a room of 400, and suddenly the silence that had been embarrassed became a silence with a spine, and Sterling Ashford III felt, for the first time in his charmed and gilded life, the floor of a room tilt away from him. He recovered the way his kind recovers. He smiled and spread his hands and reached, with the desperate instinct of a man whose first weapon has failed, for a second. All right. All right. He turned to Eli, and his smile was a blade now. You want to talk about this piano? Fine. Let us all talk about it. 9 of the finest pianists in this country sat down at that instrument this week for the film, and not one of them could get a musical note out of it, because it is a 100-year-old relic, and it is finished, which is exactly why we honor it, and do not play it. But by all means, the custodian thinks he knows the silent Duval better than 9 concert artists. He turned back to the crowd, and he played his ace. Loud, laughing. Tell you what, $2 million is the prize on this stage tonight. I will make you a simpler offer. Old-timer, you do not have to play a concerto. You do not have to play a scale. You get one true note out of that dead piano. Just one, in front of all these good people. And I will personally hand you $1,000 in cash. He patted the breast of his tuxedo. Beats sweeping. Does it not? The laughter that followed was the loudest of the night. It was also the worst because there was relief in it. The relief of people who had been made uncomfortable and were now being handed permission to laugh the discomfort away. And there was cruelty in it. And there was, in a few faces here and there across the hall, the beginning of shame, as some of the people laughing heard themselves laughing and stopped, mid-breath, and looked at the old man on the stage, and felt something turn over in their chests that they did not have a name for yet. Elias Whitfield waited for the laughter to finish. He had waited 30 years. He could wait for laughter. Then he said, quietly, I do not want your $1,000. Of course you do not. Sterling, Hint. And I do not want your 2 million. Then what? Said Sterling. Do you want? Eli looked at him for a long moment. I want the room to hear what this piano actually sounds like. He said, and then I want to tell them who taught it that sound. Now I have to tell you the thing that nobody in that hall knew. The thing that made what happened next possible. Because a dead piano cannot be resurrected in a single evening. And the silent Duval had been dead. Genuinely. Deliberately. Expertly killed. For 34 years. For the first week of his dawn vigils. Elias Whitfield had only stood at the rope and looked. That was all he could do. Grief will do that to a man. It will nail his feet to the floor. A safe distance from the thing he loved and lost, and hold him there, and not let him any closer. But grief, in a working man, eventually turns into work. On the 8th morning, Eli had stepped over the rope. He had done it the way he did everything. Quietly, methodically, at 4 a.m, when the only other soul in the building was a security guard. 2 floors up watching a game on his phone. He had opened the black Duval, and he had put his hands inside it. And he had found exactly where he knew he would find them. The wounds. A soundboard that was not the original. A good soundboard. A competent replacement. But not the one whose specific grain and specific age had given the instrument its specific voice. A dampening felt where no dampening belonged. A section of the bass action shimmed and choked so that the lowest octaves, the octaves that carried the deep river of the whole suite, would speak only in a strangled murmur. It was not decay. It was surgery. Someone had gone into this instrument, the way a man goes into another man's throat, and cut out the part that could sing, and sewn it shut, and called it preservation. Eli had knelt on the stage in the blue dark and understood, completely, for the first time, what they had done. Not just to him, to the piano. They had silenced the witness. They had made sure that no musicologist, no restorer, no curious young pianist could ever sit down at this instrument and hear in its bones the unmistakable voice that lived in the piano part of American Rhapsody, and start asking questions. They had killed the one thing left in the world that could testify, and Elias Whitfield, who had spent 30 years learning to bring dead pianos back to life, had looked at the corpse of the instrument his whole life had been stolen on, and had thought, I can undo this. He had brought his own tools. He had, over 2 weeks of pre-dawn hours, sourced through the quiet network of technicians and restorers who were the only professional family he had left, a period-correct soundboard from another Duval that had been destroyed in a flood, salvaged and stored for decades by a man in another city who had never known what to do with it. He had begun, string by string, felt by felt, shim by shim, the painstaking work of resurrection, and Theo Marsh had helped him. The boy had not understood it. Eli had never explained. He had simply said, one morning, come at 4, do not tell anyone, bring the small light. And Theo, who trusted the old man, the way you trust the one adult in your life, who has never once lied to you or looked through you, had come at 4 and had held lights and passed tools and kept watch and asked no questions. For 2 weeks, he had watched Elias Whitfield's stone-steady hands undo. In the dark, a crime that had been committed before Theo was even born. He had not known that was what he was watching. He had only known that it was the most important thing he had ever been a part of. They had finished 4 days before the gala, and on the last morning, in the blue dark, Elias Whitfield had sat down at the Black Duval for the first time in 34 years, and had touched the keys, and the instrument had spoken back to him in the voice he had loved when he was 27, the voice they had cut out of it, the voice of his grandmother's songs, and Eli had bowed his head over the keyboard and wept without a sound, while a 20-year-old boy stood 3 feet away, not knowing what he was seeing, only knowing that he must never, ever tell. That is what nobody in that gala knew. They thought they were watching a janitor about to fail at a dead piano. They were watching a master sit down at an instrument he had spent 3 weeks bringing back from the dead, an instrument that now remembered everything. Sterling Ashford III stood on the stage with the microphone in his hand and a smile like a knife. And he said, one true note. Old-timer, that is the whole show. Get one true note out of that dead piano, and you are $1,000 richer. Otherwise, do you sweep? And Elias Whitfield turned away from him. He turned to the piano. He reached into the inside pocket of his gray coat, over his heart, where for 21 mornings he had carried a folded copy of the gala announcement, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, folded soft, with 3 decades of being carried and unfolded and refolded in 100 rented rooms, the original manuscript of the Deliverance Suite, in his own hand, dated 34 years ago. The ink gone brown at the edges. He took it out. He unfolded it, and he set it on the music rack of the Black Duval, not the pristine published score of American Rhapsody, which sat in its leather, binding on the gleaming new piano across the stage, but the wounded, water-stained, handwritten truth. The room did not understand yet, but it was watching now. Every soul in it was watching. Eli pulled out the bench. He sat down at the piano the way a man sits down in a chair he built, with his own hands. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Sterling. He put his hands flat on the black lacquer of the fallboard for a moment. Palms down, The way you might lay your hand on the chest of someone you had thought was dead and found breathing. His lips moved. No microphone caught it. But Theo Marsh was 6 feet away. And he would swear for the rest of his life that the old man's mouth shaped 4 words. I know it was not you. Then Elias Whitfield lifted the fallboard and set his hands on the keys. And he played one note. He played the lowest note of the deep river. The note that for 34 years had spoken only in a choked murmur. The note whose whole voice a rich family had paid a man to cut out. It rang full and dark and enormous. A black wave of sound that rolled up off the stage and out across 400 people and up into the gilded dome and hung there. Impossibly. A note with grief and freedom, both inside it. A note that no one in that hall had ever heard from that instrument, and that a great many of them, without knowing why, felt in the center of their chests, like a hand closing gently around the heart. The note faded. The silence after it was the loudest thing in the building. And then Elias Whitfield began to play the Deliverance Suite. He did not play American Rhapsody. Understand that the 400 people in that hall had heard American Rhapsody 40 minutes earlier, played brilliantly, by a virtuoso, on a perfect piano, and they had believed it was a masterpiece. Now they heard where it came from. He played the spirituals down to their root. He played the deep river, and it was not the vague, pretty, nationless river of the Rhapsody. It was the Jordan and the Ohio and the wide, dark water between a person and their freedom, and it moved under his left hand like something alive, and hunted, and unstoppable. He played the chariot, and it was not a decoration. It was a prayer. The coded, desperate hope of people who sang about a ride to glory because they were not allowed to speak plainly about a ride to the north. He played the trouble that nobody knows, and the wade in the water, and beneath and through and around all of it, the architecture, the towering, original, world-class architecture that a young man had built out of his grandmother's hymns in a practice room 34 years ago. The architecture that a dying old man had stolen note for note and dressed in a new title and called the Voice of America. They knew that was the thing. That was the terrible, beautiful thing. 400 people who had applauded American Rhapsody an hour before sat in the gold-lit dark and heard the Deliverance Suite pouring out of a janitor's hands on a piano that was supposed to be dead, and they recognized it. Not the way you recognize a stranger, but the way you recognize the truth behind a lie you had believed. Because it was the same music. It was manifestly, undeniably, note for note, bone for bone, the same music, except that this was the living thing, and the other had been the taxidermy. This one had names in it. This one had a grandmother in it. This one had a river that actually went somewhere, in the 3rd row. Eleanor von der Meer put her hand over her mouth, near the service door. Renee Charles had stopped recording. She was standing perfectly still, with tears running down her face, and her phone forgotten at her side, because she had understood, all at once, the whole shape of it, 34 years of it. And she knew that she was not watching a performance. She was watching a resurrection, and a trial, and a verdict, all at once. And she was the reporter who was going to tell the country, and in a seat of honor, near the front, a very old woman, who had not moved or spoken all evening, leaned forward. Her name was Adaize Okoro. She was 84 years old. She was, by common agreement, the greatest living American conductor, and one of the first black women ever to hold a permanent podium at a major orchestra, which she had done after 2 full decades of being told, in the quiet channels, that she was difficult, was not the right fit, was making things about race. She had been invited to the gala as a guest of honor. The Ashford Foundation loved to have her in the front row of these things, a living testament to how far the institution had come. And she had come, because at 84 you take the seat and you save your strength for the moments that matter. She had known Elias Whitfield, not well, but she had been a young conductor in 1990, and she had heard, through the same channels that carried every warning about every dangerous black artist, the story of the brilliant young composer in residence who had accused Sterling Ashford Sr. of stealing his work, and had then, conveniently, disappeared. She had heard it, and she had been young and frightened for her own fragile career. And she had said nothing, and she had spent 34 years not knowing whether the story was true, and being afraid that it was. Now she was 84, and she was listening to the answer. She knew, within 8 bars, exactly what she was hearing. She had conducted American Rhapsody 9 times. She could have written out its piano part from memory. And she sat in the front row of Vandermeer Hall and listened to a man they had called the Janitor play the living original of a work she had helped make famous on the very instrument it had been composed on. And she felt the last 34 years of her own careful silence rise up in her throat like something she had swallowed and never digested. When Elias Whitfield reached the final movement, the resolution, the deliverance, the promised land on the far side of the ocean of grief, the passage that in American Rhapsody had made hardened critics weep in 1991 without any of them knowing whose promised land it really was. The old conductor stood up. She stood up in the front row, and she did not sit back down, and she did not take her eyes off the man at the piano. Sterling Ashford III saw her stand. He saw Eleanor Vandermeer weeping in the 3rd row. He saw the network cameras, which had been ordered to capture his coronation. Slowly, Onebiwan, turn away from him and toward the old man in the gray coat, and Sterling Ashford III stood alone at the center of a stage he had believed he owned, holding a microphone that had become a brick, and understood the way his grandfather had never had to understand, the way his kind almost never has to understand, that the floor was gone, and there was nothing under him but the truth. Elias Whitfield played the last chord. He let it ring. He let it fade. He lifted his hands from the keys and folded them in his lap, and he sat in the silence, and the black Duval sat under his hands, resurrected, humming faintly with the ghost of the last note, remembering everything, and for 4 full seconds, nobody in Vandermeer Hall made a sound. Then Elias Okoro, 84 years old, the greatest living conductor in America, put her 2 hands together in the front row and she clapped. Once, a single clap that cracked across the silent hall like a struck bell. Then Eleanor Vandermeer clapped. Then the gray-bearded cellist. Then the woman beside Eleanor. Then a critic near the back who had reviewed American Rhapsody twice in his career and was doing arithmetic in his head that was making him sick. Then a whole row. Then a whole section. The applause climbed the tiers of the hall, the way fire climbs a dry hill. And by the time it reached the back, it was no longer applause. It was a roar. 400 people on their feet. And the sound of it put physical pressure on the chest of every person in that room and up in the broadcast truck. The director leaned forward and said, very quietly, to no one, do not cut. Do not cut away. Elias Whitfield stood up from the bench. He did not bow. He turned, slowly, so that his whole body faced the crowd. And he waited, and the roar climbed higher. And then he raised one hand, just lifted it, palm out, the way you calm a frightened animal. and 400 people understood at once that he had something to say. And the roar came down, and down, and down, until Vandermeer Hall was quiet enough to hear a man breathe. He looked out at them, 61 years old, iron and salt, in a gray custodian's coat, standing beside a black piano he had raised from the dead. "These are not new songs," he said. His voice was low, and it carried, and it did not shake. "The oldest of them is older than this country. They were made by people who were not allowed to read, and not allowed to marry, and not allowed to keep their own children, and were not, most of them, allowed to keep even their own names." He let that sit. They made these songs in the field and in the dark, out of the only things they were permitted to own, which were their grief, and their God, and each other. They coded them, so the men who owned them would not understand what they were really singing about, which was the way north, and the river to cross, and the country waiting on the far side. The hall was absolutely still. Everything you call American music comes out of those songs. Eli said, "The hymn and the blues and the jazz and the rock and the whole voice this country is so proud of, all of it, down at the root, is theirs, and you will not find a single one of their names in tonight's program." He looked, for one long moment, toward the marble bust of Sterling Ashford Sr. In the lobby beyond the doors, you will find the name of a man who put his own name on their songs. And on mine, a sound went through the crowd. Not a gasp. Something lower. The sound a room makes when the last piece drops into place and the whole picture is suddenly, sickeningly clear. My grandmother sang me these songs. Elias Whitfield said. She carried them north out of South Carolina in her mouth, because it was the only thing they could not take from her. She cleaned houses in this city for 40 years, and she never once let anyone buy her silence. He reached down and touched the brown-edged manuscript on the music rack. "I wrote this for her. I called it the Deliverance Suite. I finished it in a practice room in this building, on this piano, 34 years ago. And a man who was supposed to be teaching me took it and changed the name and put his own on it. And when I asked this institution to tell the truth, they offered me a great deal of money to keep quiet for the rest of my life." He looked out at them. I told them no. The silence held. I have been asked, tonight, why I never said anything. Why a man who could do this, he gestured, was at the piano, at the manuscript, at 52 minutes of the most important American music of the century, sitting resurrected on a stage. Why a man who could do this would spend 30 years sweeping this floor and saying nothing. He paused. "I was not hiding," he said. "I was keeping a promise to my grandmother and to my wife, that I would not let them turn our songs into a thing you could buy and sell and lie about. The only way I had to keep that promise was to keep the truth alive, somewhere they could not reach it. So I kept it. Here." He touched his chest. "For 34 years, until tonight, and then." Adaise Okoro walked out of the front row. She was 84. She walked slowly, with a cane, and the whole hall watched her cross the floor and climb the 4 steps to the stage. And no one moved to stop her. Because you do not stop the greatest living conductor in America when she has decided to walk somewhere. She crossed the stage to Elias Whitfield, and she took his hands, his stone-steady hands, the hands they had never once looked at, in both of hers. And she held them, and she said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, in a voice that shook where his had not, "I heard the stories in 1990. God forgive me. I heard them, and I was afraid, and I said nothing." She lifted his hands slightly. The way you lift something you are presenting to a room. I will not be afraid tonight. This man is Elias Whitfield. And American Rhapsody is that photograph. The 84-year-old conductor holding the janitor's hands beside the resurrected black piano. The brown manuscript open on the rack. 400 people, rising again to their feet, ran on the front page of every major newspaper in the country the following morning. By the end of the week, it had run around the world. Sterling Ashford III did not speak again that night. There was nothing left for him to say. He stood on the stage for a moment longer, holding the dead microphone, and then he set it down on the piano bench. Carefully, the way a man sets down something too hot to hold. And he walked off the stage, past the wings, past Theo Marsh, out a side door, and into the cold October dark. And the last image 400 people had of him was his back. The reckoning that followed was not loud. The best reckonings never are. It came the way water comes through a cracked foundation. Slowly, then all at once, then everywhere. Renee Charles published first. Her piece went out to her newsletter at 14 minutes past 2 the next morning, under the headline, "The Man Behind the Piano." And it was the finest thing she had ever written. 12,000 words of it. And by noon it had been read 4 million times. She had the recording of the performance. She had the recording of Sterling calling a grown man-boy into a microphone. She had photographs of the old program with Elias Whitfield's name and title on it. And in the days that followed, working with an appetite she had not felt since before the layoff, she found the rest of it. The practice room logs, the technicians' invoices for the restoration of the Duval, that had cost far more than a restoration should, and had done the exact opposite of preserving. A retired stagehand who remembered a young black composer playing something extraordinary, alone, at night, all those years ago, and a musicologist at a university across the country who had wondered for 20 years why the piano part of American Rhapsody sounded like it had been written for one specific instrument that nobody could name. The Ashford Foundation did what institutions do when the foundation cracks. First it said nothing. Then it said this was a complicated historical question that deserved careful study. Then, when the recording of Sterling and the word boy had been played on every network in the country and discussed on the floor of the state legislature, it hired a firm of independent musicologists. Because it had run out of other doors, the independent study took 4 months. Its conclusion was not complicated at all. The Deliverance Suite, by Elias Whitfield, was the sole and original source of the work published as American Rhapsody under the name of Sterling Ashford Sr. The report used the word appropriation 11 times and the word masterpiece twice, both times about Eli's suite. Sterling Ashford III lost the $2 million. The jury, reconvened, declined to award it to a performance of a stolen work. He lost his recording contract. He lost the concert dates that had been booked 2 years out. His name, which had opened every door in the music world. I began to close them. He was. In the end, I mentioned one final time that spring, in a small item in the arts section of a paper, which noted that the Ashford Foundation was being quietly renamed and its bust of Sterling Ashford Sr. removed from the lobby of Vandermeer Hall for reconsideration. His name was printed once, in the middle of the item, and the article moved on. And that, being reduced to a subordinate clause in a story that was no longer about him, was, in the end, worse for Sterling Ashford III than any speech Elias Whitfield could ever have made. Eli did not take the $2 million either. The board, cornered and contrite and desperate to be seen doing the right thing, offered it to him directly. along with the royalties from 34 years of a work that had earned a fortune under the wrong name. It came to far more than $2 million. Eli listened to the offer in a small wood-paneled room, with a lawyer that Renee had found for him. And when they were finished, he said that he would accept the royalties owed to his grandmother's songs and his own 3 years, on one condition, and that the condition was not for himself, but that comes at the end. First there was the interview. Renee Charles had been waiting, while the network reporters swarmed Eli in the days after the gala, shouting questions about the money, about the lawsuit, about how it felt. She had not pushed to the front. She had waited until the noise died down. And then she had asked him, simply, if he would sit with her for an hour. He had said yes. They met in his workshop at Vandermeer Hall. Among the tools and the strings and the smell of felt and old wood, and she set a recorder on the workbench between them and let it run without touching it. And she asked him the only question that mattered. Who were you? She said, before the mop. He was quiet for a while. Then he told her. He told her about his grandmother, and South Carolina, and the church piano, and the sorrow songs. He told her about the residency, and the old maestro's kindness, and the practice room, and the black Duval. He told her about the premiere, and standing up in a room, applauding his own stolen life, and the money they offered him, and the promise to Ruth. He told her about 30 years of tuning other people's pianos. Was it shameful? Renee asked gently. All those years, tuning other men's instruments, when you could have. Tuning a piano is honest work. Eli said, there is no shame in honest work. My grandmother cleaned houses. There was no shame in her. Either. He looked at his hands. The shame belonged to the men who could have said my name, and knew the truth, and chose not to. It was never mine to carry. I just carried it anyway. For a while. The way you do. He was quiet. That is the thing about that kind of silence. They hand it to you, and it is not yours. But if you hold it long enough, you forget whose it was. Why the Duval? Renee asked. Why bring it back at all? You could have just told the story. Why spend 3 weeks in the dark, resurrecting the very piano they killed? And for the first time in the whole interview, Elias Whitfield smiled, because a story is a thing they can argue with. He said, but a sound is a thing they have to hear. He nodded toward the workshop, toward the hall, toward the black piano beyond it. They cut its voice out because they were afraid of what it could say. I put its voice back, so it could say it. He paused. I do not think I fixed that piano. I think we recognized each other. It had been silenced, and I had been silenced. And neither of us was broken. We were just waiting for somebody to listen. Renee wrote that down. She underlined it twice. 6 months later, on a corner in the north end of the city, 4 blocks from the house where a woman had once carried a hymn book and a suitcase north out of South Carolina, there was a building with fresh paint and a new sign over the door. It had been a shuttered public school. The royalties, 34 years of them. More money than Elias Whitfield had ever imagined, touching, had bought it, and repaired its roof, and filled its rooms with pianos. Good pianos. Resqued pianos. Mostly. Instruments Eli found the way he had always found them. In church basements and pawn shops and the back rooms of people who did not know what they had. Brought home. And brought back to life. By a man who knew how. The sign over the door said, The Deliverance School of Music. Below it, smaller, a second line, the Whitfield Fellowship, founded this year. All who have music in them are welcome. The condition Eli had put on the settlement was this: that a fund be established in his grandmother's name to do two things. The first was to give a free, complete, world-class musical education to black and brown children who had been priced out of the conservatories their whole lives. The children with the gift and none of the money. The children this city was full of. And this city's great halls had never once let in the door. The second was to find and restore and perform the work of black composers who had been erased, the ones whose songs had been stolen, whose names had been scrubbed, whose manuscripts sat forgotten in attics and archives and library basements all over the country, waiting, the way the Deliverance Suite had waited, for somebody to sit down and let them speak. Theo Marsh was the first employee. He had left Vandermeer Hall the week after the gala, and no one had tried to stop him. He ran the instrument shop now, and he was learning, from the best in the world, how to bring a dead piano back to life. He still brought Eli a coffee every morning. Black, no sugar, Rene Charles Peace. The man behind the piano won every award. A piece of writing can win. Her old paper offered her the music desk back. As a senior critic, with her name on the masthead, she accepted, with two conditions in writing. The paper agreed to both. The Black Duval was there. Of course, the Ashford estate, unable to stomach the public relations of keeping the piano that had testified against it, and advised by its lawyers that it could not legally do much else, gave the instrument to the Deliverance School for a token payment of $1. That single dollar bill was framed on the wall of the school's front office, below a small hand-lettered card that read, simply, receipt. The Duval sat in the largest room, its true voice restored, and children played it every day. And above it on the wall was a new brass placard, engraved by Elias Whitfield himself, that told the whole truth of the instrument in 90 words, ending with a line that made grown musicians stop and go quiet. It was silenced for 34 years. It is not silent now. And there was a girl. Her name was Imani Cole. She was 9 years old. She lived 6 blocks from the school with an aunt who worked 2 jobs. And she had, everyone agreed, something, a thing you cannot teach, a way of finding her way around a keyboard that made older musicians raise their eyebrows. But she had stopped playing. She had stopped playing, and very nearly stopped speaking. 8 months earlier, after her mother died, and no one, not the aunt, not the school counselor, not the 2 music teachers who had tried, had been able to reach her. She would sit at a piano when she was made to crime, and put her hands on the keys, and play nothing, and stare at the wall. Her aunt had read Renee's article. She had driven the 6 blocks and walked Imani into the Deliverance School on a Tuesday evening and said, "I heard there is a man here who is good, with the ones nobody else can reach." Elias Whitfield came out of the instrument shop in his gray coat. He did not crouch down and speak to the girl in the bright, false voice adults use on grieving children. He did not ask her to play. He walked past her to the Black Duval, and he sat down on the far end of the bench, and he left room, and he began, quietly, to play one of the old songs, the one his grandmother had sung him to sleep with, the coded one about the river and the far shore, and he played it soft and simple, the way it had been sung in the dark 200 years ago. And he did not look at the girl at all. Imani Cole stood by the door for a long time. Then she walked over. She climbed up onto the empty end of the bench. She put her small hands on the keys of a piano that a rich family had spent a fortune to silence, and an old man had spent 3 weeks bringing back to life. And she found, without being shown, the low harmony under the melody, the deep river, the note they had cut out, and Eli had put back. And she played it. Once. And it rang. The old man kept playing. He did not stop. He did not make it a moment. But he said, "Lo," so only she could hear it. The 4 words he had said to the piano, and to a broken creature in another man's story, and to every silenced thing he had ever been able to reach. I know it was not you, and Imani Cole, who had not really spoken in 8 months, who had been told in 100 small ways by a world that does not look twice that her grief was an inconvenience and her gift was an accident, took a breath, a real one, the kind that reaches the bottom of the lungs, and she kept her hands on the keys, and she played the river with him, all the way to the far shore. Outside, the October light was going down over the north end of the city, gold on the brick, and through the tall windows of a school named for Deliverance, you could hear 2 pianos becoming one, an old man and a 9-year-old girl, playing a song older than the country they were sitting in, a song made in the dark by people who were never allowed to keep their names, a song that had been stolen and buried and silenced. And that was not silent now. Down on the corner where the school met the street, there was a small hand-painted notice in the front window. Theo had made it. Scrap wood, White House paint, a steady hand. It read, "If you have music in you and nowhere to play it, this door is open. Come in." Eli has never said anything about that notice. He pretends not to know it is there. Theo pretends not to know that he pretends. Before we end this, I want to tell you something. The first time I heard the whole of Elias Whitfield's story, the practice room, the theft, to the money they offered him, the 30 years with a mop, I had to stop. I sat in my kitchen for a long time and looked at the wall, and I kept coming back to one thing. And it was not the theft. And it was not even the $2 million. It was the mop. 30 years. This man, one of the great musical minds this country ever produced, swept a floor for 30 years, in the very building where they had stolen his life. And he did it well. And he did it with dignity. And every single day, hundreds of people walked right past him and saw nothing. Saw a uniform, saw a task, saw a category, never once saw the man, because the man was doing a job we have all quietly agreed does not contain anyone worth looking at. And here is the part that should keep you up tonight. He was never the one who was broken. You know who was broken. The man on the stage. The man in the $2,000 tuxedo who had to snatch a microphone and call a grown man boy in front of 400 people just to feel tall. The family that had to cut the voice out of a piano because they were afraid of what a sound might say about them. They were the broken ones. Elias Whitfield was never broken. He was just silenced. And silenced is not the same as broken. Silenced means there is a whole voice in there, intact, and waiting. And all it needs is one person willing to listen. So here is what I want to ask you tonight. Who are you walking past? The man who cleans your office after you go home. The woman at the counter you do not quite look at. The old guy tuning the piano at the back of the church. The kid everyone has already decided is not going to amount to much. You do not know what they used to be. You do not know what they still are. Right now, folded up and carried against the chest, waiting for one person to ask the right question, gently enough that they finally answer. Somebody in your life is Elias Whitfield, and nobody has bothered to look twice. If this story moved you, do one thing for me. Not tomorrow. This week, look somebody in the eye who is not used to being looked at. Really look, and say something real. And watch what happens to their face. That is all. That is the whole assignment. Because the silence they are carrying was probably never theirs to begin with. Somebody handed it to them. And sometimes all it takes to give it back is 4 words. And a little bit of listening. I know it was not you. Share this with someone who has been told they did not belong in the room. And the next time you walk past a person the world has decided is invisible, slow down. Look, you have no idea who is sitting at the back of the room, holding the truth against their chest, waiting for the moment they have decided to choose. Good night.